Hey Steve, Antonio here. Thank you so much for that detailed video.
Antonio, it makes me so happy to see how much progress you're making on this box. It looks really good, especially considering I think I'm throwing some real advanced level stuff at you right out of the gate, and you're tackling it just fine.
I am probably going to have too much glue, but I don't know. Maybe that's better than not enough. I don't know.
Knowing how much glue to put on a project is just one of those things that you just kind of get a feel for over time. I would err on the side of putting too much glue on, definitely, because then the only problem with adding too much glue is it makes a mess and you'll have to clean that up. And the best advice there is to try to wipe off any excess glue while it's still wet with just a damp cloth, or even a dry cloth works fine. That'll make it easier to clean up later. If there's dried glue on the project, you can always sand that off. But I'd much rather see that than a joint that's starved of glue. If there's not glue on all surfaces, then anything that's contacting won't stick together. The perfect amount of glue would be where you clamp the pieces together and you see small beads of glue squeezing out of that joint. I really like what you're doing here by using those 2x4s. That helps to spread out the clamping pressure along the length of each of those boards. It's a great technique when you don't have a lot of clamps.
As you can see, I was able to get to the part of the project. You were exactly right. That last part that I should have had my son available to help me basically able to put everything together. I didn't have all the type of clamps that you were talking about, but I think I did a decent job. Right now this looks like some type of alien nest sitting in the corner of my garage. But one thing I really appreciated is you broke out that terminology. I had no idea about rabbets and just the different cuts and how to use the dado blades. Walking me through was very, very useful because I still made a lot of mistakes. Actually, when I first put the dado blades on, they were too wide and they were actually touching the metal of the actual dado blade, whatever that blade protector is thing. So I actually cut it down a bit and went over with a few passes instead of just two, because I didn't think metal on metal was a good thing.
I'm glad you trusted your instincts on that. You definitely don't want metal touching metal in that situation. And it sounds like your dado insert plate might not be wide enough for that wide of a stack of dado blades. You did the right thing. Just reduce the number of blades until it fits well.
Now, after I installed the dado blades, I was very nervous to use them, especially on these boards I had spent so much time putting together. So that was a great point about taking a scrap piece of lumber and running it through and seeing, is this going as deep? Is this going as wide as you want it? And that's exactly what I did. And I realized, okay, I need to adjust this just a bit. Once I got that fine-tuned, then I went through. The one thing I was disappointed in myself, well, it was a small mistake, but the sides of the board here, sides of the box, I think I cut maybe a tiny bit too small because they just fit right in. There was a little bit of daylight I saw, right? Well, not daylight, but basically I'm like, oh man, maybe I should have gone a little bit larger, but overall it looked good. The little parts about keeping the grain together, I really appreciate. And as you can see, I was able to clamp it together. Probably didn't have as many clamps as I would have liked. Only had a few clamps, my pipe clamps along with the ones that you told me to go grab. I don't have that strap clamp, but it is now on my list to go grab it.
Yeah, cutting those end pieces to fit perfectly can definitely be a challenge. It's one of the most challenging parts of this whole project, but I had gaps on mine too. In this video, we're gonna fill them up. I got gaps inside my box too. I ain't gonna worry about it. There's probably one trait that almost all woodworkers seem to share, and that's being hypercritical of our own projects. I always like to tell new woodworkers the same thing. One, no project is going to be perfect. I've been woodworking for 40 years and I have never completed a project where everything was perfect on it. The second thing is never point out your mistakes to people. Well, you can point them out to me, well, and the thousands of people that are going to be watching this video. But in general, don't point out your mistakes to people. They'll never know. Only you are going to see those minor imperfections. Oh, and then the third thing I always like to point out to people, if you're building a piece of furniture or whatever, just always put the crappy side against the wall.
Looking forward to the next parts, and yes, I am a little bit nervous about cutting into this thing, but with your guidance, hey, we're gonna make it happen, right? Excited, waiting for the next part.
Okay, Antonio, today's the big day where we get to separate the lid from the rest of the box. But first I want to make sure that I give this a good sanding, because usually those rabbets in the panels won't quite mesh up. So you just want to make sure that everything is flush. I'm using 120 grit sandpaper in my random orbit sander for this. If you had some spots that really needed a lot of material removed to make it flush, you might want to go to a coarser grit, say 60 or 80. The main thing to be aware of here are the edges. Try to keep those edges crisp and don't let the sander round them over. So just keep sanding that until you get 6 flat and smooth surfaces. It'll look really nice once you get that done, but you probably have some of these little gaps there where those rabbets didn't quite fit right. Let me show you how to fix those. After all of that sanding, you've probably accumulated quite a bit of sanding dust in the dust collector that comes with your random orbit sander. So I'm going to use that to make some wood filler for those cracks. I'm going to be using weld bond glue for this just because it dries clear, and I think that the color matches a little closer. But if you don't have it, you can use wood glue for this, the yellow wood glue. It's just that the color might not exactly match the wood. But the beauty of using this method rather than buying some wood filler or wood putty from the hardware store is that you're using the exact same wood that you sanded with. So ideally the color should be pretty darn close. I'm going to use a putty knife to just blend this together. Just mix some of that sanding dust with some glue and just make kind of a paste out of it, or a putty. You should be able to form a bead kind of like that. Here's a good example on the end of the box here that I need to fill in. Let that dry for about an hour or so and then sand it off. Make sure you get all of the glue sanded off all of the surfaces of the wood. It should only be in those cracks. Next, I want to ease over all of the sharp edges on this box. They can be really uncomfortable to feel, especially if you run your hand along them. Plus, rounding those over just slightly will prevent them from forming splinters if you were to hit it against those edges. I prefer not to do this with a power sander because it's just too aggressive and you'll probably end up getting too much of a rounded edge. So what I like to do is just use some sheet sandpaper and just use my hand as kind of a backer, and then just kind of go over those edges until they feel smooth and not sharp. It doesn't take much. I still want these to look square, just not sharp. Okay, you should be able to run your hand over all those edges without any fear of slicing your hand. Oh! Just joking. All right, so now comes the Bravery Test. I stole that from Bob Ross, the painter. You know, he used to make like a beautiful painting, and I would think it's almost done there, and then he would say, okay, now it's time for your Bravery Test. And what he would do is he'd do like a put a huge swash of paint right down the middle to make like a tree in the foreground. That was your Bravery Test. So what we're gonna do here is separate the lid from the rest of the box, and of course we only get one shot at this. Make sure you've identified the top and the bottom so you don't cut the wrong way. The idea here is that we'll just take the box and run it through this way on all 4 sides, cutting that lid off. I want to move my rip fence over to 1 7/8 of an inch. To take accurate measurements, you need to be aware of the material that's going to be lost because of the thickness or the kerf of the blade, which is about 1/8 of an inch on most blades. So I want the lid to be 1 7/8 inch. So I want that 7/8 inch mark to be on this side of the blade, and once I get that set in, and I can lock it down. So it's going to be removing this part, but the lid will still be 1 inch and 7/8. And want to make sure that I'm not setting it over here or even in the center of the blade. Always take measurements on one side of the blade or the other. Before you make these cuts, double check everything. Check your measurement, make sure it's right, and double check to make sure that you've got the top part of your box against the fence. I'm gonna lower my blade down to just a little more than 3/4 of an inch high. Make sure you've got a firm grasp of the box and it is pressed against the fence as you feed it through. I like to cut the two long sides first and then one of the two short sides. You could probably just go straight ahead and make that final cut, but I like to usually support this side of it so that when it finally releases, it doesn't just bind together, potentially on the blade. So I just take a piece of cardboard and fold it over and stick it into this side. And then what I'm gonna do is just duct tape this together. I've had success cutting these apart without doing this, but I don't know, I just kind of feel better making sure that it's supported on this side. I mean, so much work has already gone into this box, I'd hate to screw up the lid. All right, I can take this off. Hey, look at there. Got a lid. Don't be surprised if you've got some of these areas where it just doesn't quite match up evenly. I almost always get that, so I'm just gonna sand that all down smooth. You just keep going around and sanding off some high spots if you see them, just so you can get a good fit. You know, it doesn't have to be perfect. And by the way, if anybody watching this is wondering why I make boxes this way, assemble the entire cube and then cut off the lid, rather than just make the lid and the box separate. The main reason is that once you cut these apart, the lid and the box will line up and match perfectly. And the second reason is so that you have this really cool grain pattern that is unbroken. It fits between the two sides. In fact, you can probably see it here a little bit better, how this all matches. If I was to turn it around this way, you can see where it doesn't match. So it's just a small detail. One other thing about building with solid lumber, one of the advantages to building this project with the solid lumber is because there's so much sanding involved with it to make sure that everything is flush, and you just can't do that with plywood. The top veneer of plywood is so thin that once you start sanding that, it's just gonna disappear and leave a big ugly spot. Once you're happy with the way that fits together, ease over these sharp edges. Mostly you don't need to drive yourself crazy trying to get a perfectly tight fit all the way around, because once we put the hinge on there, that's gonna raise it up slightly. So there's gonna be a slight gap around there anyway, so any irregularities aren't going to show. One other thing, all of you watching this video, if you're interested or if you're following along with this and want to build this project yourself, I've got plans down in the description. These aren't the finalized plans, I'm modifying them as the project goes along. And also in this video, I'll post a link to all of the hardware that we're going to get for this project. I'm still waiting for some of it to arrive. Oh, and for all of you who watched my last video about the weird apocalyptic red weather we're having, it's still the same way, but now it's like raining ash. It looks like snow out there.